Council of San Francisco will be given to each person whose question is discussed on this program. KGO-TV brings philosophy to you in the person of Dr. Adler, one of America's foremost philosophers, director of the Institute for Philosophical Research in San Francisco, and editor-in-chief of the two-volume Syntopticon, or Encyclopedia of the Great Ideas. Today, Dr. Adler takes us further into the discussion of government.
Good afternoon. Last week, we gained some understanding of the necessity of government. This week, I hope we can use that understanding to see if we can explore and examine the nature of government. But before we do that, my associate, Lloyd Luckman, thinks that there are some questions that we ought to answer first.
Yes.
Lloyd?
Dr. Adler, your remarks about the anarchists last week provoked a question which I think you ought to answer before you go on with your discussion for today. This question is from Meyer Kahn, who lives here in San Francisco. And it's, he says, communists and anarchists are both revolutionists. And he asks then, are the communists carrying on the same revolution which the anarchists began in Russia?
No, Lloyd, it seems to me it's exactly the opposite. The anarchists wanted no government at all. The communists, in their revolution, have set up perhaps the most totalitarian of all forms of government. In fact, I would guess that the anarchists who were against the absolute rule of the Tsar would be even more revolutionary, if there were any left in Russia, which I think probably is not the case, would be even more revolutionary against the present one-party totalitarian regime of the communists. So that they're exactly opposite in their character, not the same at all.
So that certainly should clear that point out for not only Mr. Kahn, but many other listeners. Now, you know, it seems awfully hard for the American people today, Mortimer, to think about this topic of government without thinking about communism. And when they think about communism, according to the mail we receive at any rate, they think about McCarthy. So I have a question here on the subject of McCarthyism. I don't know whether you're going to want to answer it or not, but, well, here goes. Shall I read it?
Yes, please.
It comes from Mrs. Betty Meyer, who lives in Richmond, California, and reads as follows. Perhaps this is more a political issue than a governmental one, but would you say that Senator McCarthy is sincere in his spy hunt, and does he have a moral right to accuse men without proof?
No, that certainly is not a question about government.
No, I admit, but...
It's not even primarily, in my view, a political issue. For as a matter of fact, as Mrs. Meyer suggests, it really is basically a moral question.
Yes,
she asks in her own words, Lloyd, she says, has Senator McCarthy, I would make it anyone else, has Senator McCarthy or anyone else a moral right to accuse men without proof? The answer to that question, I think, Lloyd, is given to us by God himself. It is found in the 9th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness. And there are 3 things I'd like to say about the 9th commandment. First, that the 9th commandment, though most people, I think, tend to forget it, is just as an important prohibition as the prohibition that thou shalt not commit murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. And secondly, it's an injunction against much more than committing perjury in court. It's an injunction against libel, slander, defamation of character, detraction, anything that would do anybody an injury either in name or reputation. And still more important, it seems to me, Lloyd, because I think this is something that a great many people, even if they thought of the 9th commandment, would misunderstand. It is most important to recognize that it's not only an injunction against saying what one knows is not true, it is also an injunction against saying what one does not know to be true. Now, thus, for example, if I were to say what I might think, though certainly I do not know, that Senator McCarthy is not sincere, that he is only masquerading as a patriot, but in reality is a self-serving politician who would not stop at anything, at any lie or deceit, to serve his own personal ambitions. If I were to say that, I would be violating the 9th commandment. Don't you agree, Lloyd, that I would be violating it as much as those who charge others without evidence or proof of being communists?
Yes, that's a very serious sin against charity.
Well, then that's why I can't answer Mrs. Meyer's question as to whether or not Senator McCarthy is sincere. Nevertheless, I'm glad you asked the question because it's an important one, but it certainly has taken us away from our subject. Can we get back to the subject?
Yes, and though it's taken away from our subject, Mrs. Meyer's not the only one who asked a similar question.
I'm sure that's the case.
Well, I have a question I think will bring you right back on the subject then, Dr. Adler. And this is by Miss Eleanor George, who lives on Jackson Street here in San Francisco. She says that Lincoln stated in his Gettysburg Address that our government was established as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, do you think that this can be true, this of, by, and for, in a country as large and complex as ours?
Yes, Miss George, I think it can be true. In fact, I think it is, even though our country today is much larger and more complex than it was in Lincoln's time, I think Lincoln's principle is truer today than when he first uttered it. In fact, I think it is truer, much truer even than at the time when our forefathers brought forth upon this continent a nation dedicated to that principle. To understand this, to understand why our nation, our government today is more than it was in Lincoln's time, a government of the people and for the people and by the people, I think we have to understand the nature of government. And that takes us right to the problem we want to discuss today. So that if there are any other questions, Lloyd, let's hold them until we go on with this discussion and then pick them up at the end. In order to go on and discuss the nature of government in terms of the necessity of government as we understood that last week, let me take you back to the blackboard, to the main diagram that we had on the board when we were concerned with those three fellows, Jones, Smith, and Brown, who organized an expedition to go into the Brazilian jungle and find the headwaters of the Amazon. You recall, we saw that the only way that these three could stick together and act together to reach their common goal, which was finding the headwaters of the Amazon, was by means of some form of government which they could work together under and accept. Either the rule, the leadership of one man, Jones, or majority rule. And we saw, as we understood this, that this principle of government as making men able to work together for a common goal applied to any form of social group. A small social group like that, a family, any organization or association, and, of course, the state itself, our political community. Now, of course, we're not interested in any form of government or any kind of government. We're mainly interested in political government, the government of our civil society, or what is sometimes called civil government. And to ask ourselves what the nature of civil government is, we have to be concerned, first of all, with what the common goal men have in mind, what common goal men have in mind when they associate in that form of community we call a state. What is the common goal of the political community, which is the end of civil government? Now, there are three answers to that question that I'd like to suggest to you. One is given by Lincoln in the phrase that Miss George quoted in her letter. It must be government for the people. The goal of government, or the end, is the good of the people governed, not the good of those who govern or those who exercise or use the powers of government. Another answer to the question is given to us, as you recall, in the Declaration of Independence, in those words which it says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Such rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but not only those, because those are referred to as merely examples of those rights which men have naturally and unalienably. In other words, the end of government is to secure for men all their natural and unalienable rights. And the third answer, which doesn't disagree with those but says it another way, is that the end of government is the common good of the society, the general welfare, the common good of men associated in a political society, or their general welfare. Now, when you say the common good or the general welfare is the end of civil government, you could have in mind two things. You could have in mind, for example, what some men do have in mind, that the common good and welfare consists of the happiness of all men, their material and spiritual welfare in every respect. I think that is too much to ask government to do. I think that is too large an objective. I would like to suggest that the common good or the general welfare is a more limited objective than that, and precisely because it is a more limited objective, it sets certain limits to the powers of government. I say that that limited objective of civil government aiming at the good of the ruled, the good of the people who live under the government, is civil peace, the peace of the civil community or the civil society through justice, through the administration of justice. Now let me see if I can explain what I mean by civil peace through justice before we go further into the nature of civil government. In the first place, by peace, we ought not to understand complete harmony of all men, the total absence of disagreement or differences of opinion or policy or conflict. No human society from now until the end of time will have such harmony. No, what we mean by civil peace is the ability of men to live together, differing in many ways, having conflicting interests, having many differences of opinion about what should be done, but able to settle their differences without resort to violence. But not settle them anyway. Settle them justly. For if the settlement is not just, you do not really have peace. In fact, when you think you have peace because no one is in fact in arms against one another or fighting without justice, you have below the surface of that apparent peace rebellion or war seething. John Locke, who was one of the English political philosophers who influenced greatly our own founding fathers, pointed out that men cannot long stand oppression, nor will they long suffer abuses and injustices. And when injustices thrive in a society, they would rather return to a state of war than put up with a peace that is not really a peace at all because they do not have justice. In fact, as Locke pointed out, the word rebel comes from the Latin word rebellare, which means return to war, because the peace is not a good peace. And St. Thomas, before him, said exactly the same thing. Men always fight, men always will fight to get the justice they think they deserve. And so you don't have peace in a real sense unless it is maintained through the administration of justice. Now then, supposing that we understand the end of government to be the maintenance of civil peace through the administration of justice, what is the very nature of civil government? Let's go to the blackboard again and see the two things, the two factors that constitute every civil government. We saw last time that government does two things. It makes rules and decisions and gets agreement on them, and it enforces these decisions. So every government must have two properties. It must have the authority to make laws and decisions that ought to be obeyed, and it must also have the power to compel obedience to those laws and decisions. This is the aspect of government which is right, the right to be obeyed. This is the aspect of government which is might, the might to compel obedience. And if you look at these two factors, I think, and think about them for a moment, you will see that a government that was consisted simply of might without right would be a mere organization of force, sheer tyranny. And a government that consisted only of right, the right to be heard, because it was speaking good sense, but no might to enforce its rules and decisions, wouldn't be government at all. It would merely be friendly advice or good counsel. It would be totally ineffective as government. Hence, you see this, you will see that these two factors, might and right, or authority and power, go together and constitute all government. That makes it possible, I think, for us to grasp the very nature of government in a simple, clear definition. Put authority and force together in the single phrase, authorized force. And you can say in the first place that government consists of authorized force, but not that alone. You have to add one more word. Look here again. You have to say government is a monopoly of authorized force. Why must you say a monopoly of authorized force? Well, imagine for a moment the city of San Francisco having 2 mayors, 2 police commissioners, and 2 police forces. Now, the robbers who don't like cops might like that much better than 1 police force. But the rest of us, who look upon the police as safeguarding our law and order by enforcing law, would find 2 police forces a nightmare, a gruesome nightmare. You cannot have peace, nor can you administer justice unless the government has a monopoly of authorized force, and that is the meaning of that very special word which we apply to governments. We say of governments they are sovereign governments. They have sovereignty. To say that a government has sovereignty is simply to say that some institution in the society has a monopoly of authorized force. Now then, the $64 question that anyone would ought to ask themselves when they understand that government is a monopoly of authorized force is, how does it get that way? Where does it get the authorization to use force? Where does it get the monopoly of the force which it can use with authority? To that very important question, there are 2 answers. It can either gets it by seizure, by conquest, by usurpation, in which case you've got illegitimate government again, or tyranny. The other way that a government can have a monopoly of authorized force is by consent and constitution. I think some of us tend to forget how important that word is we often use of ourselves. We are not only citizens, but we are constituents. We are constituents. This means that we have in ourselves the power to constitute the government under which we live. This is the meaning of popular sovereignty, that we, the people, are the source of the sovereignty the government exercises. The government gets its monopoly of authority and force or authorized force from us. Here again, the Declaration of Independence gives us the answer. What the Declaration says, as you recall, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And here again, if I can return to Miss George's quotation of Lincoln, Lincoln gave us the answer. This is what he meant by saying government of the people first. I know some political scientists who think that Lincoln didn't mean anything by the word of, that they can explain his meaning for the word by the people and for the people, and that Lincoln put of the people in there merely to fill out, in his wonderful sense of rhythm, to fill out the sentence. I don't think so. I think the primary thing is government of the people, meaning that the people are the source of the government's sovereignty, that it comes from them. That is why it is of them, derived from them. Now then, with this understanding of the nature of government, let's take one step further forward to understand how government works to keep the peace or maintain the peace through the administration of justice. Many centuries ago, the great Roman lawyer and senator, Cicero, made the extremely wise observation that men can settle their differences in 2 ways, whereas the beasts of the jungle can settle theirs in only 1. Cicero said, men can settle their differences either by fighting, as the beasts do, or by talking. And the human way to settle differences is by talking. Now, I should like to go on then and say that it's the very nature of government in the administration of justice for the sake of peace, by the exercise of a monopoly of authorized force to settle all human differences by talking instead of by fighting. In fact, my second definition of government would be that it's the machinery, the vast machinery for keeping the conversation going, to prevent men from stopping in the business of talking and starting to fight. Let's go back to the blackboard once more and consider Jones and Smith. Suppose we think of Jones and Smith and think of them as two men living in a society. Now then, Jones and Smith differ about who's to hold a particular office. Do they fight it out? No. The institutions of government permit them to go to the polls and, according to their acceptance of majority rule, decide that act, that issue between them. Who is to be a certain officer, hold a certain office by an act that is an act of talking, which is voting. Or suppose they disagree about what kind of a rule should govern them, what kind of a law should be made on a given subject. Again, they may vote on this at an election, or they may elect representatives who will debate the matter, talk it out in a deliberative assembly, and when the law is passed, their issue will be settled. Or take the third case, in which Jones and Smith disagree about the boundary line between their farms. Now, if there were no government, they might, because it was a serious matter, settle this difference by stones and blows. But what they do in a civil society where governments administer justice and keep peace is to hire lawyers, go to court, talk it out, accept the decision of the court, or not accepting it, have the decision, if it is justly reached, enforced upon one of them. Thus you see how government keeps the peace by making the conversation go on and preventing men from fighting. And when you see this, you begin to see what the basic powers of government are. They are the traditional powers, often all children know in reading civics books: legislative, judicial, and executive. The power of making laws or rules, applying those laws or rules justly to particular cases, and carrying out laws or rules, enforcing the law or enforcing the decision of a court. But contemporary governments, if you and I think about what's going on in the United States today, appear to do much more than this. They take care of public education, public health, security, economic security, the conservation of natural resources, economic planning, all of these things in the name of the general welfare. This is the problem we shall face next time. A very difficult problem, because it looks as if in our day the powers of government were going beyond the end of maintaining peace through justice and being concerned with the general welfare in a much wider sense than governments were thought to be intended to do when our founding fathers conceived this government under which we live. Now, Lloyd, I think we have time for one more question before we close today. Have you a question that will help us focus on the discussion that we've been having?
Yes, I've been following you very closely, and I selected from my file this question by Andrew L. Perovich. He lives in Jackson, California. He says, "Dear Dr. Adler, are the achieving of internal peace and the maintenance of the society the only factors which make a government a good one? Or should its moral basis, that is, its intrinsic worth, and the qualifications of its rulers be considered as prior and more basic causes?"
That's a very interesting question. It's a very good concluding question for today. One thing it shows, and I think it's very important for us to recognize, that our interest, your interest and my interest, Mr. Luckman's interest, is not simply in government. It is in good government. More than good government, it is in what the best government is, our attempt to discover the best government. We want to know what makes government good and what makes one government better than another. And I think Mr. Perovich is right to say on moral grounds, morally better. Now, we have the answer to that question so far in very general terms. Justice is the answer. A good government must be a just government. And one government is better than another if it is more just than the other. And I think we've discovered, in part, what makes one government just or more just than another. In the first place, a government, to be just, must be government for the people. It must secure to each man his natural and unalienable rights. In the second place, to be just, a government must be of the people. It must derive its just powers, in every case, from the consent of the governed. But now, two important questions are left. What are the just powers of government? Not only must the powers to be just be derived from the consent of the governed, but the powers themselves must be the just powers of government. And our question is, what are the just powers of government? This is the very important question which we shall deal with next Sunday when we consider the powers of government and face the issue that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And then finally, the last question of all is, and who shall exercise the powers of government? And how shall they be exercised? This is the point that is the third point in Lincoln's magnificent statement. It is the question about government by the people, the problem of how the people themselves carry on or handle the powers of government. And that is the question or the problem I should like to deal with in the last Sunday of the month when we conclude this discussion of government. I hope again that you will continue to send in these extraordinarily good questions, these excellent and penetrating questions, because they help us, Mr. Luckman and me, to plan this program and to find the things that are important for us to discuss as we go on with the discussion of government. So please, if you will, send in any question about the powers of government, or backward about the nature and necessity of government, or about the justice of government and what makes one government better than another. Thank you very much.